everyone, I'm Gary Fader and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to talk about woodworking shop safety, how to protect yourself from the tools and stay safe. Just to start, a little bit of background. John Jones gave me a call and asked me if I would do a program like this. And he asked me because he was aware that I had been woodworking since 7th grade shop, so that goes back about 60 years. And also that my career was in nuclear power plant safety. So a lot of experience with accident analysis and communicating experiences, and that included personnel safety. So I'll be telling a few stories based on that. One of the things that to be aware of is when we talk about learning from experience, the expression we used to use is the best experience you can have is somebody else's experience that didn't go very well. Learn from that and avoid repeating the mistakes. So I'll be talking about a few personnel injury cases that I'm aware of, both from woodworking as well as from power plant safety. There are 8 issues that I'd like to talk about, mostly in the area of body protection. These will be somewhat repeated as we talk about operating various tools. So let me start with the basic mechanism of protecting yourself, and that involves doing this. And every tool you use, power tool at least, typically has some power source that you should take advantage of disconnecting before you change a blade or change a router bit. Most tools also have a switch lock that you can pull out. For example, here's a router table, switch lock that can be pulled out and incapacitates the switch, even though it's still plugged in, but that's just a mechanism to make sure nothing inadvertently starts while you've got your fingers into a mechanism or on a blade. If your tool happens to be hardwired, there's probably a breaker that you can flip to remove power from the tool before you start working on it. So that covers 2 things, electrical plugs and multiple switches to disconnect power. The third thing is always be aware of where your fingers or your body may be in relation to any equipment. This goes especially for saws, chisels, anything that can affect you. There's another kind of a expression used, and that is before you touch a saw blade, make sure you can count the teeth. And the idea is it should be stopped to the point where you can actually count teeth and not see any rotation. I'm aware of one situation where a woodworker reached across a table saw blade that was coasting down to remove a cutoff, and the story didn't end well. So just an example of what can happen when you're not just maintaining full awareness of the situation. A 5th area is to avoid binding or kickback, especially from a table saw. Let me bring you over here. For those of you who may be new to the hobby, this is called a riving knife, and its purpose is to keep wood separated as you come through the blade in order to keep it from binding. This is called a splitter, and this is a different insert. It's designed for a thin curved blade, but it's the same idea. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. There's another consideration that really kind of goes back to standing in front of a gun and being in the line of fire. And so it's another useful concept to make sure that you are not or none of your extremities are in the line of fire. And you'll hear me refer to that often. I have a doctor who does woodworking, and he's frequently repeated the story to me of having a board that he was running through a table saw kick back, and luckily he wasn't standing in front of it, but it kicked back to the point where it went through a window that was behind him, and obviously scared him quite severely, because he keeps referring back to that story when we talk about woodworking. Another bit of history, my history, is when I first started woodworking, a neighbor and I both bought radial arm saws, which you may be able to see behind me. And he was one of these fellows who moved quickly. And I can remember watching him sort of run around this radial arm saw and take fairly quick actions. One night I got a call from his wife from a hospital that he somehow got his hand tangled up in a dado blade on a radial arm saw. And the lesson I learned from that was to work slowly, deliberately, slowly. Think about what you're doing all the time. The last thing I want to mention is not wearing gloves or long sleeves around any rotating equipment. There's a situation that occurred in one of the nuclear plants where there are two machine shops in a nuclear plant. One's a regular machine shop, and one is what's called a hot shop. And in the hot shop, the machinists are typically working on equipment that's been contaminated with radioactivity. So they dress out in coveralls and wear gloves, typically rubber gloves, that are then taped to the coveralls. And there was a situation several years ago where one of the machinists got a glove caught in a lathe. And I won't go into the details, but again, it didn't end well. The remedy for that was a bulletin that we issued to avoid using rubber gloves and use only paper gloves when you're anywhere near rotating equipment. So for us hobbyists, I would just say don't use gloves in the shop and avoid wearing long sleeves. So just to reiterate, these are the 8 things that I think are the most safety-related issues. Disconnect your power. Use multiple switches if something's hardwired. Always be aware of where your fingers are, where your body is, especially with saws and chisels. When you're dealing with a saw and getting ready to do something like remove a cutoff, make sure you can count the teeth. Always use a riving knife or a splitter when you're running something through a table saw. Stay out of the line of fire. Work slowly. Avoid using long sleeves or gloves, especially around rotating equipment. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about personal protection. So you can see I'm wearing safety glasses, and these are prescription. So they're specially made safety glasses with, I guess, polycarbonate lenses and side shields. I keep these right outside the door to the shop, so I always put them on before I enter the shop, regardless of what I'm going to do. But there are other things to consider. You can always get a pair of safety goggles of some kind. I keep extra of these if I have visitors. Safety shield is a really good idea that I recommend highly, especially for lathe work or router work. And one thing that most guys don't think a lot about, but eye protection can be important if you're using any kind of chemicals like a paint stripper. And there again, I'd recommend using a face shield if at all possible when you're using some kind of chemicals. Lung protection. These dust masks. This happens to be a Dust Be Gone. They make a lot of different types of dust masks. They're on the order of maybe $25 or $30 a piece. I have several of these. The nice thing is that I can throw them in the washing machine and just rotate through them. Vapor filters. Anytime you're using spraying paint or using other kinds of chemicals, I'm always amazed at how I can be spraying paint with one of these on and be totally unaware of any odor. I mean, they just work really well, and you just get one that fits your face well. One thing to consider strongly is, before the dust gets into the air, collecting dust at the source. And there's a lot of fancy ways of doing it. If you have the wherewithal and you can pipe dust collection system into your shop, that's great. I use a dust collector with a hose and a mechanism that you can buy from Rockler that basically plugs into every power tool I have. I mean, just as an example, here's a spindle sander, and I can just plug that in and turn it on and collect the dust before it gets into the air. For handheld tools, that same thing will plug into one of these, I don't know what you call it, big gulp dust collectors. So you can set that next to whatever you're sanding, for example, and collect the dust before it gets to you. The last thing I'll mention, if you can look up, there's a area filtration system, and you can run that while you're making sawdust. The nice part about this one, and maybe it's common to all of them, it has a timer, so I can let it run for 2, 4, 6 hours after I leave the shop and clean the air, so the next time I come in, it's all cleaned up. Coming back here, the last thing in this area is hearing protection. You can buy the little foam things that fit in your ear, but I would encourage you to get a good pair of earmuffs, comfortable ones, so they don't cause fatigue after a while, but it's a good idea to have something that really protects your hearing. You know, hearing is one of those things that you lose gradually, so you're not aware that something's happening until years later maybe. I've got several friends that were unfortunate to work in very noisy factories, and later in life they've really lost a lot of their hearing. One thing of caution is it's good to have the protection on, but you don't want so much sound deadening or music playing, for example, where you can't hear equipment starting to malfunction. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about the bandsaw. But I worry about having other distracting noise so that, or noise filtration, so that you may have something going wrong with a piece of equipment and not be aware of it. Let's talk about lighting for a minute. This shop may not be the best example because there's a lot more modern lighting than I've got hanging around here with fluorescent lights. I've been in some shops lately that have all LED strings of lighting, and it's really nice and bright. But I just encourage you to have adequate lighting in your shop, and consider having lighting on certain pieces of equipment. If you can pan over to the lathe, for example, you can see a gooseneck lamp that will light up work on the lathe. Here's a light on the bandsaw that you can adjust. Come over to the workbench. I've got a pretty good fluorescent light above it, but I also have focused lighting that helps when I'm doing some stringing or working on something on the workbench. So I encourage you to keep things really well lit. The first rule of thumb, and this can be a tough one, is don't stand in front of the work. Any kind of a kickback you don't want to be in front of it. So try to stand to one side or the other and run the work through the machine. If you sense or observe wood burning, something is wrong. Either the blade needs cleaning, and there's lots of easy ways. Here's a CMT product that you can spray on blades or router bits, and in a couple of minutes it'll dissolve the material that builds up on the blades. Occasionally you'll have to sharpen a blade or replace a blade. So that's one problem that causes burning. The next thing to check, if you're experiencing that, is the alignment between the miter slot, the blade, and the fence. So these should all be in good alignment to avoid any sort of cocking or binding, which may be causing the burning. Here's another lesson learned. I have a orthopedic hand surgeon that I talked to recently, and what he was telling me is what he sees most with woodworkers that come in with hand injuries is a person will be partly through a cut, and for one reason or another something isn't going right, and they'll pull the work back. And unfortunately, when you do that, it's almost impossible to keep it perfectly aligned, and so it'll kick back, and that's what causes a majority of hand injuries that this particular surgeon was aware of. I mentioned before, but never try to clear cutoffs while the blade is spinning, even if it's coasting down. So we talked about that before. We also talked before about using splitters and riving knives. Be aware that a blade has a particular thickness. This is a normal width blade. It measures 1/8 of an inch. The riving knife behind it is going to be about a 64th thinner, so that the work will slide past it, not bind on the riving knife, but not bind on the blade as it's passing through. Remember, when you're cutting a piece of wood, it's relieving the tension in the wood, and so it's possible for it to start to squeeze. This zero clearance insert is set up for a thin curved blade, and if you put a measurement on a thin curved blade, it's about a 32nd less than the 1/8 inch blade, and therefore the splitter is going to be thinner as well. So these things have to be matched in a way where they're effective. So just be aware of that. I'm a big user of feather boards. They really make what you're working on a heck of a lot safer, as you can adjust the feather board and press the workpiece against the fence so that you've just got an awful lot of support as you're guiding a piece of wood through a blade. As you're cutting a piece of wood, you're going to reach the end of it, and what you don't want to do is have to reach over the table to keep it from falling on the floor. So a cut-off table, or as you can see here, a support that will support the board as it comes off the table saw table will avoid you having to do that. These are zero clearance inserts, important to use if you're cutting off a thin piece of wood. You don't want the wood to end up getting caught between the blade and the insert. So using a zero clearance insert will prevent that from happening. The other thing is using push sticks. If you've got the wherewithal and you want to buy a fancy gripper, that's great. I find these are more than adequate, easy to make. It's got a little notch here that will hook onto the wood and you can push it through. It keeps your hand well away from the blade. Another style, just a little bit fancier with like a little more of a handle, but same idea. And you can just push it push it through. Not many of you may have these. They've sort of been replaced by chop saws, but they're kind of the main tool for cross-cutting. Again, it's an opportunity to be very conscious of where your hands and fingers are. Any of these saws have a tendency to pull forward very quickly, so you want to make sure that, again, your extremities are not in the line of fire. One thing I'll point out on a radial arm saw is they can be rotated like that and used for ripping. It's a scary operation, and I highly recommend you never do it. That's the main reason I bought a table saw after I had this saw. I won't go into details, but I'll just tell you it's a scary deal. This is probably a tool that I use more than anything else in my shop for the types of things I make. It's very effective at straight cutting and resawing. In other words, cutting a board into a thinner board. I like to use a tall fence which hooks onto my regular fence, and I can set this up and use a double width featherboard and have a very safe and effective way of resawing a fairly tall board on end. So it just keeps things easy to do and safe, and you get a nice clean straight cut. If you happen to watch the video that I did on making bandsaws, you'll notice that I was able to cut off the back of a block very evenly using this kind of a technique. Have a push stick and reach for pushing through. You can see the value of that. I'd rather have these slices in this thing than in my fingers, so I keep that right there where I can reach it easily. Okay, as you're cutting a piece of wood, especially one that's going to be some kind of a scroll, you want to make sure your fingers are never right in front of the blade. So this is not the right place for them. This is the right place for them. And always keep your fingers to the side or the back of the piece of wood. You can't get cut on the back of a bandsaw blade, but you can sure slice a finger off from the front. So that's just another opportunity to stay out of the line of fire. If you're sensing that the work is getting hard to push through the blade or it starts to cause burning, the blade probably needs to be replaced. And I mentioned before about being able to hear equipment. If you hear a blade start to click, it's probably about to break. So it's time to shut it off and examine the blade. Fortunately, a bandsaw breaking is not typically a problem. It doesn't whip around. It just stops as it breaks. But it's another reason I don't like these ear muffs with Bluetooth music in them, because I may not be able to hear something like that coming around. Okay, so this is my router table, and right now I have a round over bit in it that you can see. The important thing about maintaining safety with a router table is the sharp side of the bit is where you want to feed a piece of work. This has a bearing on it, so if I'm going to route a round over on the edge, I want to feed it into the blade from the side where it's sharp. So this rotates counterclockwise, so I'll be putting this up against the bearing and moving it through that way. If you try to do a round over from the other side, I think it's referred to as climbing. What you're going to find is it's going to tend to push the work out of the way, and It's just not gonna go well. If you're gonna use a fence, you have to think through again which way to push it through, so that you're not climbing, but you're having the sharp edge of the blade feeding, the work is feeding into the sharp side. There's a lot of attachments that go with a router. Here's a handheld router. You can use all kinds of edge guides and bushings and fences and miter gauge and push pads on any router equipment. If you're using a handheld router, freehand, just hold on tight. And again, make sure your eyes are being adequately protected, because they can throw off a lot of chips. Here again is an opportunity to use a feather board against a fence. That just tends to hold the piece in place much better. So this is my lathe, and the first thing you want to do when you're about to use a lathe is reach up for a convenient place, have your face shield. Very important. A lathe really throws off an awful lot of chips, as well as sometimes whole pieces. So I'm always amazed when I see somebody working on a lathe with just glasses on. To me, that's pretty scary. We talked before about never wearing gloves or long sleeves around rotating equipment. I won't tell you the story again, but it was a scary situation with someone getting sucked into a lathe by their gloves. When you start a lathe, you really want to stand to the side. I would be on the other side because my switch is on the other side, but you really want to be out of the way, especially if you're starting up a turning that's large or unbalanced. You want to make sure it's not going to come off as you first start it up. Speed is real important. This is a copy of a page out of my manual that came with the lathe, and what it shows is it's got a column for diameter of the work, under 2 inches, 2 to 4 inches, etc. A roughing RPM, a general cutting RPM, and a finishing RPM. So very handy sheet. I encourage you to have one for a lathe that you're using. Always make sure you're working with sound wood. Some spalled wood can be pretty subject to breaking apart, so make sure the wood is sound. You want to make sure your wood is securely mounted. This is a spur center that you hammer into the piece of wood before you mount it. Here's a chuck that's sometimes used to hold a piece of wood. And there are face plates and other things that are used to attach the wood, but you want to make sure it's securely mounted. Whenever possible, engage your tailstock to keep anything from whipping around, especially if it's in a chuck, for example, if that's possible. You'll find that woodworking tools dull pretty quickly, and you'll recognize it when you find yourself pushing harder and harder to get some wood cut. I have my sharpening slow speed grinder right nearby with my one-way jig that holds tools in place to sharpen them. So again, be sensitive to the fact that tool is starting to dull and sharpen it up. It'd just be a whole lot safer than pushing hard on a tool. One tool I'll mention that I have a lot of respect for is a skew. For those of you who may be starting with lathe work, I encourage you to get a lot of instruction and practice with a skew. It's a tough tool to use. It can turn out to be somewhat dangerous if it catches, and can also ruin the piece of work pretty quickly. Okay, coming over here to drill press, one consideration, safety thing is you've got a key for locking the bits in place. This can become a hazard if it's left in the chuck when the machine's turned on. So good idea to attach it to a chain or have a place for it that you know it's out of the way. The other consideration is as you drill, especially if you're using a large Forstner bit or a circle cutting bit, is the work is going to tend to rotate and difficult to hold. It can cause some hand injury, so I encourage you to have some way of locking down a piece of work that you're drilling so that it stays in place. Next piece of equipment I just want to mention is a jointer. I don't have one, so I can't show you personally, but you never want to operate a jointer without the blade cover in place so that you don't have an exposed blade to get tangled up with. Always use push pads or some kind of a stick to push the work through. Keep your fingers at least 3 inches away from the cutter head. And as you push a piece of work through a jointer, train yourself to walk with the work so you're not reaching far and losing control of the piece of work. Chisels, again, not really my forte, but they need to be sharp, very sharp. And although that sounds maybe counter to avoiding getting cut, what it avoids is the tool slipping or forcing you to put more effort or force into it. You should expect a chisel is going to slip sooner or later. So you really need to keep your hands out of the line of fire. And finally, talk about first aid for a minute. I have a first aid kit that's in my shop. You probably have the same kind of things, bandages and first aid items somewhere in your house, but it's very convenient to have a kit in the shop where you can get to bandages or any kind of a wrap or a tourniquet in the shop. So encourage you to do that. Also, these kits typically come with instructions that are worth reading periodically. We also have a DVD in our library from Mark Adams on shop safety. And as you have time, I would encourage you to see Roger Moister and check that out and watch it. The other thing that's on our website now is an article that came out of Fine Woodworking on first aid. It's a really good article that talks you through what to do for minor cuts and abrasions, serious injuries, lacerations, fractures, amputations, eye injuries, fumes and dust, and even talks about what to expect if you go to an emergency room. It also has a page that shows you what is useful to have in a first aid kit and some immediate instructions, first aid information for various types of injuries. So I would really encourage you to get on our website, print out a copy of this, and read it periodically. So overall, I hope this has been helpful. You should always be thinking about safety as you're working in the shop. Avoid distractions. I know personally I have a tendency to want to look at the clock when I'm working on something, and I have to hold myself back from doing that. And the last thought, the frequent thought, is stay out of the line of fire. So work safely.